Good morning. All right, well, today we're going to finish up. Well, I won't say we'll finish up. The narrative here is going to shift away from Joseph for a little bit after today. So the narrative here still is on Joseph, and then it will shift to Jacob for a bit, and then the last chapter of Genesis is back on Joseph. If you want to turn to Genesis 47, just pick up where we left off. So we left off, Joseph's family, which is Jacob's family, has now settled in the land of Goshen with Pharaoh's support and blessing. Last week, Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And I'm going to pick up back here on verse 13, so 47:13. Now there was no food in all the land because the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. Joseph gathered all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the grain which they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. When the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food, for why should we die in your presence? For our money is gone." Then Joseph said, "Give up your livestock, and I will give you food for your livestock, since your money is gone." So they brought in their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for their horses and the flocks and the herds and the donkeys. And he fed them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. When that year was ended, they came to him the next year and said to him, "We will not hide from my lord that our money is all spent, and the cattle are my lord's. There is nothing left for my lord except our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we and our land will be slaves to Pharaoh. So give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate." So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for every Egyptian sold his field because the famine was severe upon them. Thus the land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he removed them to the cities from one end of Egypt's border to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had all an allotment from Pharaoh, and they lived off the allotment which Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, "Behold, I have today bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you, and you may sow the land. At the harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own for seed of the land, for seed of the field, and for your food, and for those of your households, and as food for your little ones." So they said, "You have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my lord, and we will be Pharaoh's slaves." Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, valid to this day, that Pharaoh should have the fifth. Only the land of the priests did not become Pharaoh's. Now Israel lived in the land of Egypt in Goshen, and they acquired property in it, and were fruitful and became very numerous. Let's turn to the Lord in prayer. Lord, once again, we open the pages of the book you've given us that reveals you and reveals all of your attributes that you have revealed to us and all of the things that we need to know. Lord, give us wisdom as we study these things and worship you through it. I pray these things in your name. Amen. All right, so this is a part of the story of Joseph that is not as well covered and as well known. It doesn't make the little children's books, and it is, some would say, problematic. Some would say Joseph failed at his task here and became crooked and evil. I'm not going to suggest those things, but I'm just letting you know that this is a part where there's some difficulty in reading this. And so I don't want to brush over that. I purposely read through verse 27 because I think we need to keep that verse in mind as we read the rest. And so let's look at 27 real quick, and then we'll go back to the others. So remember, during the second year of the famine, Jacob moved his family to Egypt. With Pharaoh's blessing, they were given all the produce that they needed and the land of Goshen. During the last 5 years of the famine, which were severe, and I'll just ask, what's the word of wisdom today for unexpected things in your life? What's your emergency fund supposed to cover? 6 to 12 months, right? Are any of us ready for 7 years of famine? So I'm just saying that we can read this a lot of different ways, but even today, none of us is prepared for an event like this. But regardless, so in the last 5 years of famine, when things become very dire in these prior verses, what happens to the Israelites? It's just one verse. Israel lived in the land of Egypt, in Goshen, and they acquired property in it, and they were fruitful and became very numerous. Now, I don't know exactly, I don't want to suggest in any way that Joseph was playing some sort of game with the Egyptians and the Canaanites and therefore benefiting his family. I think ultimately Joseph represented, and we'll cover that, but he represented the issues. He represented Pharaoh to the best of his ability. And then Pharaoh compensated Joseph for it. And Joseph shared that compensation with his family. I mean, I think it's that simple. But I think we do need to keep this in mind because I think this plays in later, right? How is it that the Israelites become so numerous? How is it that they become so disfavored in the minds of the Egyptians later? The seeds of it are probably sown during these years. People start adding it together later. They're not mad. I mean, if we go back a couple of verses, they're not at all mad at Joseph at this point. They're thanking him. You've saved us. So let's go back, and we'll start at verse 13. I just want to kind of turn it backwards and just say, make sure that we keep that in mind because we're given two pictures here. The Egyptians suffer tremendously during these last 5 years, and the Israelites do very well. All right, so verse 13 and 14. And so keep in mind, we're now starting, and where verse 13 picks up is actually around year 5. So we need to keep in mind that Joseph did go to all the Egyptians, and he did warn them, hey, there are 7 years that are going to be bad. There's going to be 7 years that are very good. I'm going to start taxing you 20%, taking 20% of your produce, but you need to save up. And so it seems apparent that the Egyptians listened because they went through a number of years with being able to pay for grain. But they hit year 5 and the money runs out, right? So 13 and 14. Now there was no food in all the land because the famine was very severe. So the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. Joseph gathered all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the grain which they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. So there are those, again, that would read this and say Joseph is charging too much. Is he? Is this taking advantage? Again, I'm just it's a rhetorical question. I don't think the answer is yes, but there are those who read this critically and say he should have just given the food away. Welfare. He didn't. He charged. And by it, who's benefiting? So 15 and 17. When the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, give us food. Before I go there. So where is all the money going? It's going to Pharaoh, right? So when all the money is spent, it's going to Pharaoh. So Pharaoh is the one that's benefiting. So 15 to 17, when the money was all spent, in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph said, "Give us food, for we should die. For why should we die in your presence? For our money is gone." Then Joseph said, "Give up your livestock, and I will give you food for your livestock, since your money is gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses and the flocks and the herds and the donkeys. And he fed them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. So again, so that's year number 6. Who benefits? All of these livestock now are Pharaoh's. Is it reasonable? Is it right? I mean, if you think all the years prior, the people had to buy food for their livestock and themselves. And quite frankly, maybe many of them let their herds die. Or they went short because the herds ate too much, or whatever it was. So by doing this, Joseph is also allowing for the herds to remain, right? Because it's more likely, well, we know that God blesses everything that Joseph does. And again, I would say that Joseph has been very diligent through his life, at least in the land of Egypt, but even before. So he's going to find a way to preserve the herds to the best of his ability, and it's going to be a better source of distribution. Again, we live in a land and a time where we're very anti-big government. And this is a time when big government is actually saving people. And so it's hard to take that lens off and say, this is good what Joseph is doing. And so we have to be careful about the lens in which we look at this. But Pharaoh is benefiting, and through this, the livestock is being saved as well. And remember, Pharaoh did also say, hey, if you can bring your brothers and family who are good with flocks into taking care of my flocks as well. I mean, this plays right into that request, right? Now they're Pharaoh's. Who does that benefit? It's going to benefit the Israelites. So that's another way that they're going to get paid, or they're going to be compensated. Again, they were essentially given the land and allowed to eat for free and be there because they were part of Joseph's family. So they're benefiting. And again, I'm just going to step back and say, I'm talking at a human level here, but we can see how God is working through this, right? He is blessing Jacob's family in the land of Egypt. Okay, 18 to 20. When that year was ended, they came to him the next year. So this is year 7, said to him, "We will not hide from my lord that our money is all spent, and the cattle are my lord's. There is nothing left for my lord except our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before you, your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we and our land will be slaves to Pharaoh. So give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate." So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for every Egyptian sold his field because the famine was severe upon them. Thus the land became Pharaoh's. So the people are in a hard place. They know that the famine's going to end because they're counting, right? They know this is year 7. Next year there will be a crop. They have no ability to get seed. They have no ability to get food for themselves. And so they're saying, look, we can sit in our houses on our lands and die, and nothing will be sown, and so future generations, other people will not get food either. And they're the ones that came up with the idea of becoming slaves. They asked for this. It's not Joseph that says, oh, I've got an idea. Why don't you become Pharaoh's slaves and I'll acquire your property too? They're the ones that come and suggest this. But again, who's benefiting? It's Pharaoh. Joseph is doing this on Pharaoh's behalf. And then in verse, And then verse 21. As for the people, he removed them to the cities from one end of Egypt's border to the other. So for that last period of time, he just brought them all in and said, we'll distribute the foods, and then when it comes time for planting, we'll give you the seed, and you can go back to your properties. And it makes sense.
Joel,
Yeah.
just a personal comment.
Yeah.
I just find it really, the assumptions that I made for a good share of my life.
Mm-hmm.
You said, we talked about how this is a section that's probably not usually taught to kids Sunday school.
Mm-hmm.
It really shocked me to find out that they had to buy the food. I just always assumed that Joseph was such a good guy and he collected this food and then he handed it out.
Yeah.
Well, they did provide the food to begin with. When they took all the food to begin with.
They always had to pay. I mean, even Jacob's family went to Egypt and paid. I think the idea was the Pharaoh still has to have guards guarding the grain. He's still got to keep the grain from, being rodent infested, and who knows. Again, when you think of the amount of grain they would have had, how did it stay edible for 7 years? I mean, there's a certain amount of miraculous thing. I don't care how smart we are. I mean, as we drive to Crean's mom's house in the fall, we see these huge, huge piles of grain in eastern Washington where there's so much wheat. And they don't leave it for 7 years. I mean, it would be moldy. It would be baked by the sun in the summer. It would lose all of its nutritional value. So how did this grain stay good for 7 years? And they could still plant it. I don't know. I think the Lord is at work here. Not to say that they didn't have technology and they didn't have abilities there. Like, we can keep grain for more than 7 years. You just can't leave it piled outside in the elements, right? But if you think of how much they would have had to store, did they have the warehouses for that at the beginning? Could they have built it fast enough? We don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us how they stored it, just that they stored it in the cities. Yeah, it's a good point, though. We just don't really necessarily think about all of this administration. But yeah, for 7 years, Joseph worked to gather the grain. And then for the next 7 years, he's a busy man making sure it's distributed the way it should be. And charging whatever he charged. And again, I just go back to, if you had to save enough to buy grain for 7 years, even if price fixing was done, right? Could we all do it? Could we in the next 7 years save enough for all the expenses we would have 7 years later with no income? I don't know. Would we fall short and around year 5, 6, or 7 start saying, we're desperate, we're out of money? Yeah, Tina?
In the way I see it, it's like Joseph is collecting it, but he's also distributing it. So I don't see it piling up and piling up and piling up. It's just a constant.
Well, no, for 7 years he only collected. And they were extremely good years. So the amount that he collected was a significant amount. And then at the end of the 7 years, that's when he started to distribute. So it would have, each year the pile would have gotten higher for those first 7 years. And then each year the pile would have gotten lower. Does that make sense? Yeah. Anything else? I'll admit, it's not easy to read this. The idea that the people fell so short of being able to acquire the food that they ended up giving everything. Now, it doesn't say, we're not really told, do they and their children and their children's children all become slaves, or is it just the people who are alive become slaves of Pharaoh's? I don't know. But then we see that so we'll continue on here. Yeah, go ahead.
Footnote says that the people asked to become sharecroppers, not common slaves.
Yeah, are we uncomfortable with it and we're reading something in? I don't know. Yeah, I saw that too. There's, like I say, this goes against a lot of things that we currently look at, like bigger government is better. No, stop it. And then there's other things too, right? If, like we've talked about, that maybe the Pharaoh at this point is not actually an Egyptian. That just adds a whole nother geopolitical type thing, right? Where if all of Egypt is sold to this foreigner, is that going to sow seeds of dissension and then cause a revolt, which eventually does happen? Now, again, we know that there was a time when the Pharaoh was not Egyptian, and then there was a time when the Pharaoh was Egyptian. There are people that superimpose that time here. We don't know for sure. But if that's going on, it's a very interesting thing going on, which just means that there's a lot of depth to this story. There's a lot of things going on. But I don't think we have to say that somehow Pharaoh fell off of his walk with the Lord, and now he's become a bad man, and somehow he's taking advantage of people. But it is challenging. I mean, to think that he did all these things when he could have just gone to Pharaoh and said, Pharaoh, we could just give it away. But Pharaoh still has expenses, right? We're going to find out, verse 22. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had an allotment from Pharaoh, and they lived off the allotment which Pharaoh gave them. Therefore, they did not sell their land. Pharaoh still has expenses, right? He's got to pay the priests. He's got to pay his guards. He's got to pay his servants. So he still has a lot of expenses. And now he's going to give food away for free. What does he get in return? So we don't know. I mean, it's possible Joseph went to Pharaoh and said, Pharaoh, I'm uncomfortable with this. I'd rather just give the food away. Is that okay? We don't know. So it's just, we're not given the full story here. This is just kind of the cliff notes of what happened. 23-24. At the harvest. So this is, I think, where we see a bit of grace from Joseph, right? At the harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, and for those of your households, and as food for your little ones. So they said, you have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's slaves. Okay? So it ends, thank you very much, but he basically says, look, where are they in the end? They're living back on their property, and they're paying the same tax that they were paying before the famine started. But the land is not theirs. They've lost the ownership of the land. But everything else is the same. They're still paying the same tax, 20%. 20% is Pharaoh's, the other 80% is yours, which is what it always was. And from that 80%, they could trade, barter, and do whatever to acquire whatever else they needed. Yeah, Tina. Yeah. Yeah. And again, but it ends with them saying, thank you, and we are Pharaoh's slaves. It's their own words. They didn't say, oh, thanks for just making us sharecroppers. Again, there might be a little bit more, and I didn't dig into the Hebrew meaning of that word slaves there. I'm just taking it at face value. But they could have, and again, we did talk about how the word for slaves can also be servant in the Hebrew. Yeah.
So just out of curiosity, when the Hebrews become slaves, I didn't think that they had Egyptian slaves as well. I mean, like, is this going to last for the rest of their lives, or did you just say?
It's not made clear. It sounds to me like this generation is made slaves, and it's not their kids and their kids' kids and their kids' kids' kids, and so on and so forth. But to me, that's not clear. Because clearly we see by the time there becomes a Pharaoh that doesn't know the Egyptians or doesn't know of Joseph, he makes all of the Hebrews slaves. And you don't get the sense at that point that all the Egyptians are slaves.
And the English Standard Version is still using the word servants.
Okay, so the ESV is still using servants, yeah. And so they're at least consistent. And again, that's that idea of that Hebrew word can have the meaning of slave and can have the meaning of servant. And I think historically it's been slave in some of these contexts.
What verse is that, Joel?
Well, it'd be 26 is where we are, or 25.
Okay.
25, and we will be Pharaoh's slaves. The ESV is going to say servants.
And NIV says we will be in bondage to Pharaoh.
Okay, yeah. In bondage, slavery, or possibly sharecropping, servanthood. And then verse 26, Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, valid to this day, that Pharaoh should have the fifth. Only the land of the priests did not become Pharaoh's. So, again, what does this day mean? That's as of the time of the writing, right? So this was written either during the life of Moses or after the life of Moses. Moses is attributed as the author of Genesis. So to the day of the end of the life of Moses, which would be 500 years after this. Moses lived to be 120. And they exited, okay, maybe not 520. We don't know his exact age when they exited Egypt, right? Moses did live to be 120. It was 400 years from this time frame till they exited Egypt. So let's say 450 to 500 years from then, at least, Egypt is still holding this law that the Pharaoh gets a fifth of the crops. So the 20% tax becomes codified. Which is another thing that's interesting. So again, if that geopolitical thing is going on, even when powers change and who the Pharaoh is and there's a new usurper, oftentimes taxes just continue. Oh, I like that law. I like income. We'll keep that one on the books. So regardless of what happened with the pharaohs and when it happened, 500 years later, they are still collecting a fifth. 500-ish years. And then again, we did read 27. Now Israel lived in the land of Egypt and Goshen, and they acquired property in it, and were fruitful and became very numerous. All right, any other thoughts on that? I know I'm going to say it doesn't read real comfortable for me either. It's not like, oh, great. I feel just as good about this as all the rest of Joseph's story, okay? You do get to this point, you're like, oh, that's a little bit more challenging. And let's just face it, 7 years of no food. I can't even contemplate it. We can read, how many years did the Dust Bowl go on down in Oklahoma and that? Great. What was that?
It was about 7 years.
It was about 7 years. I mean, there's some fantastic stories as the country was expanding many people just lost absolutely everything and had to tried to not pack up any dust, but packed up all their belongings and went somewhere else, whether it was California or somewhere else with a great promise, because there was no rain or very little rain for 7 years. All right. Moving on. Verse 28, Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, so the length of Jacob's life was 147 years. All right, so here we get just kind of a quick statement that for 17 years Joseph lived here, and then the rest of this chapter and chapter 48 is kind of his wishes and his blessings. So 29, when the time for Israel to die came near, he called his son Joseph and said to him, "Please, if I have found favor in your sight, place now your hand under my thigh and deal with me in kindness and faithfulness. Do not bury me in Egypt. But when I lie down with my fathers, you shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place." And he said, "I will do as you have said." He said, "Swear to me." So he swore to him. Then Israel bowed in worship at the head of his bed, or at the head of the bed. All right, so just a couple comments here. Like when we see that Judah was playing a leadership role among the brothers and in Jacob's life when Joseph is not present. But here at the end of his life, he calls Joseph. It's just an interesting shift. And there could be something about this where he's asking a promise that Judah could not fulfill, right? I don't want to be buried in Egypt. I want to be buried in Israel or in Canaan. Is that something Judah could have exacted and promised? Probably not without Joseph say so. So Jacob went directly to Joseph. So 17 years. And another thing to point out, so they're there 5 years during the famine. 17 years would be 12 years more than that, right? So 12 years later, he calls Joseph in and asks this promise, and Joseph gives it. So there's an indication here that Joseph has still retained a certain amount of power and influence in Pharaoh's court. What that is, we don't know, right? Joseph was given tremendous power. He was given the ring, the necklace, and the robe of Pharaoh. He was given basically the second chariot. Whatever Joseph said it was the same as if Pharaoh had said it. So I don't know if we can make the assumption that still is the case 12 years after the famine ends, but I think it's just as likely that's still the case as not. So I do want to call out, there's a little bit of controversy about verse 31, which let's go ahead and hit that head on. So then Israel bowed in worship at the head of the bed. Does anyone have NIV? How does that read?
His staff, the top of his staff.
Yeah, he worshiped at the top of his staff. Head of his bed, worshipped at the top of his staff. Let's go to the New Testament. Hebrews 11:21. And if you're in your pew Bibles, it's page 1204. Hebrews 11:21. By faith, Jacob, as he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. So which is it? Head of the bed or top of his staff? This is another case where the influence in the New Testament of the Septuagint's translation into Greek plays a role. The Hebrew consonants for staff and bed are the same three consonants. And Hebrew, as it's written, they only write the consonants. They don't fill in the vowels. And so as they translated the Septuagint, they added the vowels that made it staff. While the Hebrew Bible is largely understood, and still to this day, it is largely understood that it should be bed. Now, there's all kinds of thought. Was he? He's an old man. He's near his death. And remember, God touched his hip, so he is lame. So he does have a staff. If he was weak, was he sitting at the foot of his bed? And remember that their beds are not like our beds. So likely the beds were just more of a mat on the floor somewhere. So the head of the bed could be either what we would consider the foot or the head. Could he have sat at the foot or worshiped at the foot or the head of his bed, while leaning on his staff? So could it be both? Or was he standing? Anyways, it's just an interesting thing. I don't want to say it's a huge controversy. It doesn't change the meaning. He is worshiping the Lord. So he bowed in worship. Whether that bowing is over a staff or at the head of the bed, he's still worshiping, or if it's both. But again, it's just another place where the New Testament has influenced it because of the way the Septuagint was translated. And in some cases, in an attempt to bring the Old Testament into line with the New Testament, some translators now are just changing that verse to say staff, even though historically the Hebrew has been understood to be translated head of the bed. So just another interesting word study. There's no way to truly resolve it. But again, it's not a main thing. It doesn't change what Scripture says. It's just another one of those cases where we can see a slight change of meaning from the old to the new. And again, it's like I say, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they still found those same three consonants. So the three consonants are definitely all the way throughout all manuscripts. It's really just which vowels are you going to add. So. All right. Oh, look at that. We're out of time. Time flies when you're having fun. So 48, we're going to get into Jacob's blessings. And the first part is the sons of Joseph, or it is only the sons of Joseph. 49 is Jacob's sons directly. And I will just make a plug. I found this out. I haven't actually been using this, but we do have it in our church library. It's called the Genesis Record, written by Dr. Henry Morris. I always thought this was just a book that was about, Dr. Henry Morris started the Institute for Creation Research, ICR, in California. I always thought this was a book just about like the flood and creation. But it's actually it's a devotional that goes throughout the whole book of Genesis. And it would have been really helpful as I was going through like chapter 10 with all the genealogies and looking at like that the thing we put up last week with the first 7 generations, the flood, and then the generations afterwards. He kind of digs into some of that a little bit more with some of his study. So it's in the library. This is my copy, and clearly I haven't read it because I didn't know what was in it. All right. But if any of this study, especially around some of those, whatever else, if you want deeper study, it looks like I perused, I got buried in it for over an hour yesterday, and I'm like, oh, I could have been a better teacher, but anyway, let's close in prayer. Father in heaven, Lord, thank you for these words. Lord, we can see how you are, as you promised Abraham, more than 100 years prior. You are blessing the family of Jacob in the land of Egypt and making them a people that you would later bring out. And once again, we're reminded that you keep your promises and that your promises can be fully relied on. Lord, thank you for each and every one here, and I just pray that you would bless our time of worship as we continue. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.